I've always been intrigued by what people believe and why. When it comes to the resurrection of Jesus, one of the things that fascinates me most is how many of the earliest claims are based on what people said they saw, eyewitness accounts. Not folklore, not abstract philosophy, but actual human experiences written down by people who were either there or very close to those who were. Let me put it this way, if someone today claimed that a man died and then walked out of his grave 3 days later, we'd all ask one thing, who saw it? That's the same question I asked about Jesus. And surprisingly, the answer is more people than you'd expect. According to multiple ancient sources, both biblical and non-biblical dozens. Some say hundreds claim to have seen Jesus alive after his crucifixion. This isn't just religious propaganda. Even critics of Christianity in the ancient world didn't argue that these people didn't believe they saw Jesus. They just tried to explain away. Hallucinations, lies, group delusion. But think about that for a second. Even the early skeptics acknowledged something had to be explained. The Gospels don't shy away from specifics. Mary Magdalene sees Jesus first. Alone, she doesn't even recognize him at first. That kind of detail doesn't feel like a story you'd make up. Then Jesus appears to 2 followers on the road to Emmaus, then to the disciples multiple times, then, according to Paul in 1 Corinthians, to over 500 people at once. Paul even says, in effect, most of them are still alive, you can go ask them. That line stopped me in my tracks. This wasn't written centuries later with no way to verify anything. Paul was inviting people to check for themselves. That's powerful. And then there's the disciples themselves. These weren't powerful men with influence. They were mostly fishermen, tax collectors, working class people. When Jesus was arrested and executed, they scattered. Peter even denied he knew him. 3 times these guys were scared, defeated, crushed. Yet just a few weeks later, they're back in public, boldly declaring Jesus is alive. And not just saying it. They're willing to be imprisoned, tortured, even killed for it. Why? That kind of courage doesn't come from a story you would think might be true. It comes from something you're convinced you saw. Now, some people say they were hallucinating. But hallucinations are individual. You don't get 500 people hallucinating the same thing at the same time. And these appearances didn't just happen in dreams or visions. Jesus reportedly ate with them, talked with them, let Thomas touch his wounds. You don't build a global faith on vague feelings. You build it on moments that felt undeniably real. One of the most overlooked aspects of these accounts is their authenticity and tone. They don't read like heroic fiction. They include embarrassing moments, doubts, and confusion. For example, the women are the first to discover the empty tomb. In that culture, women's testimony wasn't even admissible in court. If you were fabricating a convincing lie, you wouldn't make women your star witnesses. Yet, that's what the Gospels record. Why? Because that's what happened. It's messy, but it feels real. I also think about the early church, how fast it spread, and what it cost the people who joined. Following Jesus didn't give you power. It didn't make you rich. It often meant persecution. You don't suffer for a metaphor. You suffer for something you're convinced is true. I know some people still say, well, ancient people were just more gullible. But were they? They understood death just as well as we do. They buried their loved ones. They knew that crucifixion was final. That's why the resurrection was shocking even to Jesus' closest friends. The women who came to the tomb were bringing burial spices. They weren't expecting a miracle. Even they were skeptical until they saw it for themselves. That human reaction, fear, disbelief, awe, makes the story more compelling. It's not written like a polished legend. It reads like people trying to process the impossible. Piers Morgan often raises the point that even if you strip away religion, you're still left with a historical puzzle. How did a tiny group of terrified followers become bold enough to challenge empires? How did they convince thousands to follow a man who'd been executed in public as a criminal? Something had to spark that transformation. And according to them, it was this: we saw him. Alive, and let's be honest, eyewitness testimony still matters today. Courts rely on it. Investigations are built on it. Sure, it's not perfect, but when you have multiple, independent, and early sources all pointing to the same thing, it's hard to ignore. I'm not saying that proves it beyond all doubt. But it does force a serious question: what if they weren't lying? What if they weren't deluded? What if they really did see something? Something that changed everything. That's why I keep coming back to the eyewitness accounts. Because if they're even close to being true, then the resurrection isn't just a story. It's a claim that demands a response, not blind belief, but thoughtful, honest engagement. And I think that's something worth exploring deeply. I never used to think much about an ancient tomb, especially not one halfway across the world, supposedly left empty 2,000 years ago. But the more I looked in the resurrection story of Jesus, the more this one detail, the empty tomb, kept rising to the surface. It's the kind of historical riddle that refuses to go away, no matter how skeptical or curious you are. And honestly, it's the part of the story that pushed me to take the entire thing more seriously. Let me be clear, I wasn't looking for a miracle. I wasn't even trying to prove anything wrong. I just wanted to understand, if Jesus really did die by crucifixion, which even most historians agree on, then what happened next is where the controversy explodes. Because by all accounts, a tomb that was sealed, guarded, and known by both friend and foe ended up empty. And no one, not even his enemies, could produce the body. Think about that. If you're the Roman or Jewish leadership at the time, and you're trying to squash this uprising of Jesus' followers claiming he rose from the dead, the fastest way to stop the rumors is simply show the body. Just roll it out, display it, game over. The movement dies right there. But they didn't. And they couldn't. Now, some say, well, maybe the women went to the wrong tomb. That idea actually made me laugh at first, until I realized people seriously argue it. But here's the thing: Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy and respected member of the council, owned the tomb. He placed the body there. He wasn't about to forget where it was. The women who visited had been there during the burial. The disciples knew where it was. The guards knew. If it was the wrong tomb, why didn't anyone just go to the right one and prove it? That theory falls apart the moment you apply a little logic. Others say the disciples stole the body. But this is where things get more complicated. These men were in hiding, scared, broken. One of them had already denied even knowing Jesus. The rest scattered when he was arrested. And now we're supposed to believe that, suddenly, they had the nerve to sneak past Roman guards, roll away a massive stone, steal a body, and then pretend for the rest of their lives that Jesus was alive. Pretend so well that they were tortured and executed for it. That's not how human behavior works. People will die for what they believe is true. But no one willingly dies for something they know is a lie. If they'd stolen the body, they would know the resurrection was a hoax. Yet none of them cracked. Not one. That alone should make anyone pause. And here's something I didn't expect to wrestle with: the fact that the earliest critics of Christianity didn't deny the tomb was empty. Instead, they invented other reasons for why it was empty. That's crucial. It means even back then, the empty tomb wasn't in question. It was a fact they were trying to explain. If it were a legend, it wouldn't have been treated as a real problem by Jesus' opponents. But it was. Even modern secular scholars admit that the tomb being empty is one of the best attested facts in ancient history. That shocked me. I thought it was all based on blind faith and religious stories, but the historical trail, if you're willing to follow it, is surprisingly solid. The gospel writers were close to the events. Paul was writing within a few decades. And he even quotes earlier creeds and statements that go right back to the time of the crucifixion. Then there's the symbolism of the tomb itself. In ancient Jewish culture, proper burial was deeply sacred. If Jesus' followers had stolen or desecrated the body, it would have been seen as blasphemous, not inspiring. And yet, the resurrection narrative doesn't shy away from the awkward details. It names the women who found first, despite women being viewed as unreliable witnesses at the time. If the story was fabricated, why build it around testimony that society dismissed? The answer is simply, they weren't making it up. They were reporting what happened, even if it sounded unbelievable. And that's what drew me in: the rawness, the lack of polish. The fact that this supposed myth doesn't read like one. Still, I get it. An empty tomb doesn't prove a resurrection. Bodies can go missing for all kinds of reasons. But when you combine the empty tomb with the resurrection appearances, the transformation of the disciples, and the rapid rise of the church, it forms a picture that's hard to ignore. Like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Even if you don't walk away believing it, you're still left with a question: where did the body go? No one in 2,000 years has provided a convincing answer. All the theories either ignore key facts or rely on speculation that doesn't match human behavior. Meanwhile, the original claim that Jesus rose is the only one that accounts for all the pieces. For me, the empty tomb became more than a symbol. It became a doorway, a challenge, a quiet ancient question that echoed through time. What if it really was empty because he wasn't there anymore? And once you ask that, truly ask it, it's hard to walk away unchanged. I used to think the resurrection story was just a tale people told to feel better about death, an inspiring myth at best. But what really started to shift my thinking wasn't the empty tomb or the dramatic claims. It was the transformation of the disciples. The change in these men was so radical, so fast, and so costly that I couldn't explain it away with cliches. Something happened to them, something that changed everything. Let's start with who they were. These weren't powerful men. They weren't influencers or public speakers. Most of them were fishermen. One was a tax collector, basically despised in his community. When Jesus was arrested, they didn't exactly rise up in courage, they ran. Peter, the so-called rock, denied even knowing Jesus 3 times in one night. Not exactly the behavior of someone ready to launch a global faith. After Jesus was crucified, they hid, doors locked, windows shut. Their leader was gone, and so were their dreams. You can feel the fear in those early moments. These were men who truly believed it was over. Their Messiah was dead, and with him, all hope of what they thought he'd bring. But then something happened. Just weeks later, these same men are boldly standing in front of crowds, proclaiming that Jesus is alive, not just spiritually alive, not just in memory, but have physically risen from the dead. That's not a small claim. That's not an easy sell. And they weren't just saying it once. They said it over and over in public to people who could challenge them, arrest them, and even kill them. That shift from terrified to fearless is what I couldn't ignore. How do men who cowered in fear suddenly become unstoppable? What flipped the switch? They didn't gain wealth or safety or power. In fact, believing in the resurrection cost them everything. Prison, beatings, rejection. Eventually, almost all of them were executed, and yet not one of them recanted. Now ask yourself, why would anyone go through that for something they knew was false? If they had made the resurrection up, if it was just a cover story to preserve Jesus' legacy, someone would have broken. Someone would have said, okay, we lied, here's what really happened. But no one did. Not G-terms, not Thomas, not any of them. And this wasn't a small group locked in an echo chamber. They went to different regions, spoke different languages, faced different audiences, and yet the message stayed consistent. Jesus rose. We saw him. We touched him. We ate with him. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a metaphor. It was real. Take Peter, for example. The man who denied Jesus in fear later stood up to the same religious leaders who had Jesus killed. In Acts, he looks them in the eye and says, you crucified him. God raised him. That's not just bolzadle, unless Peter truly believed it. Then there's James, the brother of Jesus. During Jesus' lifetime, James didn't believe in him. He thought his brother was out of his mind. But after the resurrection, James becomes a leader in the early church and is eventually martyred. What would it take to convince you that your brother was the Son of God? I can't even imagine that. Unless James saw something that changed everything. And Thomas, he's the skeptic in the group. When the others said they'd seen Jesus, he refused to believe it. He wanted physical proof. So when Jesus appeared to him, capable, showed him his wounds, and told him to touch, Thomas responded with the words, my Lord and my God. That's a shift you don't make lightly, especially in a Jewish context where calling a man God was blasphemy. The more I looked into it, the more it became clear you don't get this kind of transformation from wishful thinking. You don't get men to their deaths for a rumor or a hallucination. You only get that kind of radical change if they were absolutely convinced that what they saw was real. Even secular historians acknowledge this. They may not believe the resurrection happened, but they agree that the disciples believed it happened. And belief like that doesn't come from imagination. It comes from experience. You have to remember, the resurrection wasn't a comforting idea to these men. It was a dangerous one. In claiming that Jesus rose, they were challenging both Jewish and Roman authority. They were saying there's a new king, a new order. That message was seen as treasonous. It wasn't safe. And yet, they preached it anyway. And it wasn't just the original disciples. Within a few years, thousands of people joined the movement, many of whom claimed to have encountered the risen Jesus themselves. Some of these were former enemies of the movement, like Paul, who went from hunting Christians to becoming one of the most influential voices in its growth. Something cracked his worldview in half. He describes meeting Jesus, not just in a vision, but as a real event that changed his life's direction overnight. I used to think faith meant closing your eyes and believing without reason. But when I looked at the transformation of the disciples, I saw something different. I saw men who opened their eyes to something they didn't expect, didn't understand, and couldn't deny. And maybe that's the real power of the resurrection story. And not just that a man walked out of a grave, but that the people who followed him walked out of fear, out of hiding, and into a mission that would change the world. Their transformation is still a challenge today, because if they were telling the truth, if they really saw what they claimed, then the resurrection isn't just a historical event. It's an invitation, one that's just as personal now as it was then. I've always been fascinated by how movements begin, how an idea can catch fire and suddenly spread across nations, cultures, and centuries. But nothing quite compares to the early explosion of Christianity. It wasn't just rapid, it was almost unexplainable. A small group of terrified followers went from hiding behind locked doors to changing the entire course of human history. And it all seemed to happen fast. Too fast to be ignored. This wasn't a movement born in privilege or power. It didn't start in a palace or with a wealthy elite. It began with fishermen, tax collectors, and outcasts, people who, by all accounts, should have been forgotten. Their leader had just been publicly executed in the most humiliating and brutal way possible. Crucifixion. In Roman terms, that was game over. That was supposed to be the end. And yet, within just a few decades, Christianity had spread across Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and was rapidly making its way through the Roman Empire, not by military force, not by money or propaganda, but by word of mouth, by testimony. One life to another, one story at a time. People didn't just hear about Jesus, they changed because of him. At first, I thought maybe this was exaggerated. Maybe it was a slow burn that historians later romanticized. But that's not the case. We have historical records, writings, and archaeological evidence showing that by the early 2nd century, Christian communities were established in places like Rome, Corinth, Antioch, Ephesus, Alexandria, and even as far as India and Ethiopia. That's not just impressive, it's unprecedented. And here's what really struck me. These early Christians weren't gaining status or comfort by joining this movement. They were signing up for rejection, persecution, and often death. In a society that worshipped Roman gods, called Caesar Lord, and saw religion as a civic duty, claiming Jesus as the risen Lord was dangerous. It got you kicked out of synagogues, fired from your job, or thrown into prison. Sometimes worse. So why did people keep joining? Why did it grow? You don't risk your life for a message unless something about it hits you on a soul, deep level. You don't follow a crucified man unless you believe he's more than just a man. That's the heartbeat of the explosion. It wasn't just about belief, it was about conviction. Even the Roman authorities were baffled. Pliny the Younger, a Roman governor, wrote a letter to Emperor Trajan around 112 AD asking what to do with all these Christians. He described their habits, gathering early in the morning, singing hymns to Christ as to a God, pledging to live morally. He couldn't understand why people were so drawn to this message. But he admitted, despite executing and imprisoning many of them, they wouldn't stop. In fact, more kept coming. That kind of growth under pressure is rare. Usually, when you stamp something out, it dies. But in the case of early Christianity, persecution became fuel. The more they suffered, the more others noticed. The way Christians cared for each other, how they treated the sick, the poor, even their enemies, was radically different from the Roman world, and that difference became their witness. What amazed me even more was how diverse the early movement became. From Jewish peasants in Galilee to Greek philosophers in Athens, Roman soldiers, African traders, and Asian pilgrims, Christianity transcended class, race, and culture. That kind of unity and diversity was unheard of in the ancient world. Religion back then was tribal, regional, ethnic. But this message that one man died and rose again for all humanity was universal. And people responded. Paul, one of the most influential early Christians, wasn't even one of Jesus' disciples. In fact, he was a former enemy, someone who actively hunted Christians. But after claiming to encounter the risen Christ, he became a missionary who spread the message across the known world. He planted churches in cities, wrote letters that still shape Christian thought today, and faced beatings, shipwrecks, and imprisonment. All because he believed the resurrection changed everything. And he wasn't alone. Ordinary men and women carried the message in homes, marketplaces, and roadsides. It wasn't about flashy campaigns or mass conversions. It was about personal transformation. People saw something different in these Christians, something hopeful, something real. The early explosion of Christianity also challenged the very structure of Roman society. It questioned the divinity of Caesar. It called for sexual purity in a culture that was anything but. It elevated women, the poor, the slave, the foreigner, all the people society usually ignored, that kind of revolutionary message doesn't survive unless it's backed by something powerful. To me, the only explanation that holds all of this together is that something truly remarkable happened. Something that convinced ordinary people that death wasn't the end, that grace was real, that God had stepped into history, not as a myth, not as a philosophy, but as a person. And that person conquered death. You can debate theology all day long, but when you look at the historical facts, the speed of the growth, the cost of belief, the resilience under persecution, and the transformation of entire cultures, it forces you to ask what sparked all of this. Because movements don't explode like that for nothing. Something had to ignite it, something more than good teaching, something more than a moral code. The early Christians claimed it was the resurrection, and maybe, just maybe, they were right. That's what keeps me coming back to the story, not because it's ancient, but because it still feels alive. The early explosion of Christianity didn't end in the first century. It keeps going. It keeps spreading. And maybe the real question isn't why it started, but whether I'm willing to let it change me too.